Thanks. Today's webinar is co-sponsored by the New Lawyers section and the Environmental Law section of the California Lawyers Association, or CLA. If you are not familiar with CLA or either of these great sections, please head over to the CLA website where you can learn more and see how you can get involved. Next slide, please.
Sorry, of course, PowerPoint does not want to cooperate right now. Oh, shoot. There we go.
Yeah, so many ways to get involved. Of course, you can attend online presentations like this or in-person events. You can help plan those events. You can contribute written materials for our publications. You can support law student outreach, diversity and mentor initiatives. And of course, there's plenty of great networking through the CLA and all of its sections. All right, next slide. And now a quick plug about the Environmental Law Section's signature event of the year coming up in October. It's the 34th Annual Environmental Law Conference at Yosemite. 3+ days of amazing speakers and panels, outdoor and social activities, networking and friendship, and one of the most beautiful places on Earth. Registration is open now, and you'll hear a little bit more about the conference at the end of today's webinar. And next slide. Yep. Perfect. And with that, it's my privilege to introduce the moderator for today's webinar. Suma Pisapati has been a leading advocate for environmental and climate justice in the public interest and public service sectors for more than a quarter century. Suma began her career as an Equal Justice Works Fellow at Communities for a Better Environment, where she eventually served as a longstanding board member. While working in the public interest, first at CBE and later as a staff attorney at Earth Justice, Suma led dozens of high-profile cases aimed at improving the health and quality of life of environmental justice communities in and around major industrial sources of pollution, such as oil refineries and power plants. She then transitioned from litigation to government policy work in 2019 when Governor Newsom appointed her to be the Assistant General Counsel for Enforcement at Cal EPA. Suma also regularly teaches and lectures on environmental justice and has held teaching appointments at UC Irvine, UC Davis, and UC Berkeley Schools of Law. We are honored to have you with us today, Suma.
Oh, well, thank you for that very kind introduction, Samir. And I, in turn, will introduce our esteemed panelist, Jessie Fierro, and I'll provide some comments. Jessie's asked me to provide some comments at the very end. So Jessie Fierro has more than 20 years of experience in the air quality field and is currently a senior attorney at the California Air Resources Board, known as CARB. She has served as an adjunct professor for legal writing and environmental law at San Joaquin College of the Law and Kern County, Monterey, and San Luis Obispo Colleges of Law. Jessie has been active in the Environmental Law Section Executive Committee since 2017, and we're very pleased to announce that she's the incoming chair of the CLA Board of Representatives. And with that, I will turn it to Jessie.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with you both today and with all of our participants. Thank you for taking the time over your lunch hour to learn about state climate laws. This is very much a 10,000-foot overview, like tip of the iceberg type information. We have lots of slides and we can't possibly cover all the details of all of this, but this will hopefully give you the lay of the land to understand some of the things that are going on at the state level and some of the challenges that we are facing. As Suma mentioned, I am an attorney at the California Air Resources Board, but I do need to acknowledge that I am appearing in my personal capacity. And of course, I need to be careful. A lot of what's going on here, like this is still in flux. A lot of this is being challenged. It gets more and more challenging every day to deal with these state climate law issues. So please bear with me if I can't answer your questions fully today, but just know that the work is ongoing. And hopefully you can be a part of it someday. The intent of these one-on-one webinars is to hopefully reach out to law students and new attorneys in particular, although of course all are welcome. And so I really want to encourage everyone here to consider state service. Come help us out, get involved and help fight these fights and make the headway that our state needs to make. I apologize, I'll try to fix this for posting. The link is behind the picture. But if you're interested in doing this work with us, once you are a licensed attorney or maybe even a non-attorney capacity, check out the Cal Careers website, if you are a new or any attorney, you can look for attorney or attorney one positions through the advanced search feature on this webpage. And you can look specifically for my agency, the California Air Resources Board, or some of the other agencies that are working on climate issues. So do consider joining us, and feel free to look me up if you ever have questions on how to do that. I should point out that myself and a few other CLA attorneys will be presenting a panel at the annual meeting in September, the annual meeting conference in Universal City, to talk about state jobs. So we're very passionate about getting good people to help do this work alongside us. Also want to make sure, as Samir already mentioned, being involved in CLA is great. I love being involved in CLA for the content, community, and service I receive and I get to contribute to. If you're a law student, you can join up to 3 sections for free. If you're a newer attorney, you can join CLA for free for your first 3 years of practice. And really, membership doesn't cost a whole lot when you consider how much you get out of it in terms of getting the education credits and the community and all the other things. So please, if you're not already a CLA member, we hope that you will join us. I want to recognize first and foremost that this webinar, the paragraph that convinced you to come to this webinar, it talked about both air quality and climate change. And I'm not going to talk about air quality itself for very long. I will right now, but if you're really interested in the air pollution side, separate from the climate change side, I want to note that we did an air quality webinar a few years ago, and it's still available on our YouTube page. I do want to recognize the overlap and the connections between them. And so when I talk about air pollution law, what I'm usually talking about is efforts to reduce ozone, particulate matter, carbon monoxide, the national ambient air quality standards, sometimes the hazardous air contaminants. These are the pollutants that have immediate impacts on public health. And this is super important. It's a very complex and evolving area of law. It is an area of law that is characterized by what's called cooperative federalism, and that means that in good circumstances we have EPA doing certain things, and then the state has to do certain things to comply with EPA regulation, the Clean Air Act, and the regulations that EPA promulgates, and then air districts also have a role to work with the states to meet the Clean Air Act requirements and also to regulate sources of pollution under their control. And hopefully through that process, we're reducing the ozone precursors, we're reducing particulate matter, we're reducing the toxic air contaminants. So we are improving public health throughout the state of California. And data shows that there's been a lot of progress in reducing those air pollutants, and there's still work to do. So this is a very important area of law as well. But climate change law, it falls into a somewhat different legal framework than the local air pollutant measures. Not completely separate. You may have heard very recently that EPA was rethinking what's called its endangerment finding under Air Act Section 209. And under the Clean Air Act, EPA had determined that climate pollutants were endangering public health, and therefore that things should be done to reduce those. But EPA recently proposed to reverse that endangerment finding. And in fact, the head of CARB, Dr. Steve Klipp, he provided really fabulous comments at a public hearing yesterday about why this is very backward and very dangerous to public health and the economy for California and beyond. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, I encourage you to just look up. It's on CARB's LinkedIn page. But recognizing that all that is happening, and also recognizing that there are economies of scale sometimes. Quite often you can have regulations that will reduce air pollution precursors as well as climate pollutants, and that's always a win-win. Every now and then in the past there may have been trade-offs where you had to choose between reducing air pollution and reducing climate pollutants. That isn't generally the case, but it can happen sometimes. But I do want to shift to focus primarily on how do we reduce climate pollutants. And so let's talk about how California's climate policy framework for setting climate goals and reaching those climate goals. It really started with AB 32, landmark legislation in 2006. It was really first in the nation that empowered California and directed California to reduce our climate pollutants and to achieve goals that would hopefully limit how quickly climate change was occurring. So through AB 32 and other legislation, I'll list some of those later on for your reference, and also subsequent executive orders, the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, and other state agencies were directed to achieve certain climate goals by certain deadlines. And to do that, CARB put together a series of scoping plans. The first scoping plan was set in 2008, and it's been updated a few times since. And if you're more familiar with the air pollution world, it's very similar ish to a state implementation plan where you figure out here's where I am, here's where I need to be, and here's how I'm going to do it. And so the scoping plan similarly assessed here's our emissions now, here are the targets, and here are the measures that we're going to use to try to get to those targets and as quickly as we can. After the scoping plan was adopted, then CARB and other agencies started implementing that plan, taking the specific discrete actions that would in fact reduce those climate pollutants, adopting regulations, establishing incentive programs, and so on. And then once those regulations or incentives are set, then you get to the phase where you are creating and implementing individual projects at the local level to reduce climate pollutants in our communities. So there's a lot of facets to our climate policy portfolio. So I'm sure everyone here has heard of at least some of this, but I want you to understand how varied it is because we need every tool in the toolbox we can possibly get. We need all the help we could get. That's why we need people to join state service or do what they can within their sectors to help address this problem. But even within the official state things that are going on, there's a lot of different tools in the toolbox that we're using. We can't leave anything on the table. People have opinions on whether some of these tools are better than others, but the fact of the matter is if something is technologically and economically feasible, and sometimes even if it's not, you got to nudge it along and do what you can to put us in a position of success. And it covers things like economy-wide carbon pricing, reducing the carbon intensity of transportation fuels, renewable energy requirements for utilities, zero emissions vehicles targets, building energy efficiency and electrification, reducing short-lived climate pollutants. So um, not just the pollutants you hear about all the time, and I'll talk to you more about that later, and develop state strategies for natural working lands and leveraging funding investments. And if you have questions now, just hold on to them because I'm going to talk about most of these in a little bit more detail in the coming slides. So here's a list of the key legislation for your reference. Like I said, it started with AB 32, but it didn't stop there. There's been lots of legislation since then to help refine and redirect as needed and give new goals and new directions so that we're considering everything we need to consider as we are tackling climate change for our states. And even though CARB has a really critical role in all of this, of course, and is the lead agency for a lot of what I'm talking about today, it's a multi-state agency effort. And as you can see on this slide, lots of different agencies in the state of California have a role to play in reducing climate pollutants and making sure we are climate resilient and so on. And of course, even beyond the state, we have lots of partners throughout California from businesses and NGOs and local agencies that are working with us to implement projects and to comply with regulations so that we can do whatever we can, whatever is within our grasp to reduce climate pollutants. One thing I wanted to touch upon is the role and scale of carbon dioxide removal. You'll sometimes hear this referred to as carbon sequestration. And so it is one facet of how we are tackling our climate problems. We're not just looking at what are the emissions that are going into the atmosphere anew, but for even the stuff that's already there, like what can we do about it? And apologize that this work is we run amok with our acronyms, and one of them that you see here is NWL, and that stands for natural and working lands. Natural and working lands refers to forests and fields, and there's a role for these areas to play in removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and sequestering it so it's not contributing to climate change. Uh, uh, across our planet. And so we're seeing increased ambition on natural and working lands. And again, this is not a silver bullet. No one would expect that this measure alone would be the thing that helps us get to our climate goals, but it's an important piece of it. And we're seeing really good success and innovation in doing this. And it's just getting started. I think you'll see a lot more on this in the coming years. And again, bear with I'm speeding through some of this because I want to make sure we have time to cover everything and we can talk more later if needed. One of the things that we're looking at as we tackle the state climate framework is closing the gaps on the social cost of carbon through the climate vulnerability metric. And I think Suma might be talking about this a little bit later in terms of like environmental justice and just recognize it. And you may have heard that across the globe, right? That the countries and the communities that are emitting the most climate pollutants are not usually the ones that will bear the brunt of the risks associated with climate change. And that is true, and that's something that we need to grapple with. But it's even true within the state of California. Not all communities here are going to face the same impacts from climate change. In this metric here, we're looking at the percent of income that would be uh, impacted by climate change, climate related disasters, and so on. And this can include things like increased health costs from extreme heat events. It might include things like dealing with property damage and a few other metrics. There was a really interesting scoping paper that CARB released in 2018 if you want more information on that. So just look up California Air Resources Board climate vulnerability metric. And it's not a terribly long paper, but it's pretty interesting. And it shows that, we're making an effort to recognize how different communities are impacted differently through the economic costs associated with climate change, and it helps us identify where and how to avoid disparate economic impacts from climate change. And so just to, actually, I'm going to skip this one and go to the next one in the interest of time, because as usual, everything flies by faster than anticipated. I want to talk about the cap and trade program. This is something you may have heard of. And so the cap and trade program it was launched in 2012. And the goal of cap and trade is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by putting a long-term steady price, but steadily increasing price on climate pollution. And so it establishes statewide limits on the total climate pollution, and the people emitting those pollutants have to reduce climate pollution or pay increasing prices. So there's options for them. They can figure out what works best for their business at the time that it's happening. And the goal is that the climate pollution emissions are going to drop over time. And so GHG reduction targets through this program, we were able to achieve those 2020 targets early. We've seen climate pollution down 14% below 1990 levels, and we've seen that it's spurred innovation and clean technology deployment as businesses and entities want to reduce the amount that they're paying into the program. They have a powerful incentive to reduce the climate pollutants that they're emitting where they can. But as a result, we are in fact generating revenue, and then that revenue is invested in California's communities. And as you can see here, $25.6 billion is supporting programs to improve air quality in overburdened communities out of a total $4 billion invested in communities across California. And so there's a wide range of programs that are taking advantage of this funding, and I'm going to highlight some of those in a subsequent slide here. So cap and trade covers greenhouse gas emissions across the California economy. It really complements the sector specific programs by placing an economy-wide and declining cap on statewide greenhouse gas emissions. And it covers about 400 total facilities from industry, electricity generation and importing, suppliers of gasoline, diesel, and natural gas. And by doing the program this way, we're establishing a price signal that drives long-term investments to cleaner fuels and greater energy efficiency while still providing flexibility for lower cost options. The program cap was set according to the state's greenhouse gas goals. And so this graphic gives you a visual of how this all works. And one allowance equals 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalents, and covered entities must acquire and surrender allowances from the aggregate cap in an amount of greenhouse gas emissions from all their covered facilities. And then a covered entity may be responsible for multiple facilities, but no individual facility caps are established by the program. And so really the takeaway here is that it's meant to give everyone the flexibility to do what they can, where they can, and treat everyone fairly across the board so that everyone's contributing to the solutions in a predictable way. So this was a really critical, not the only component, but a critical component in how we were able to meet our 2020 greenhouse gas emissions target early. We were supposed to be at compared to the 1990 levels, we were supposed to get to 431 and we were below that. And we are currently making progress toward meeting the 2030 targets. That analysis still needs to happen, and there's been a couple roadblocks recently that we'll have to grapple with, but it does show that so far we've had a lot of success using the variety of programs that California has at its disposal. We have had successful implementation of this program since 2021 with lots of allowances surrendered, good compliance rates, meeting that 2020 goal, and being able to generate such a high amount of funding for the California Climate Investments Program. And so that's really where the money part comes in, is once the cap and trade program happens and you generate the revenues, the proceeds are allocated by the legislature. The California legislature decides where to put the proceeds, and then the California Climate Investments, which is managed by CARB, they work with all of our other agency partners at the state and local level to identify specific projects, and then those dollars go into community projects that are reducing climate pollutants. And so you can see here about how much money was appropriated and allocated and awarded and then implemented. So there's many steps to this process, but there's a lot of transparency and accountability and reporting along the way, so we can ensure that the program is successful and people can see how these dollars are being used to benefit communities and the amount of climate pollutants that are being emitted. So I want to talk now about the direct regulations that CARB has that reduces climate pollutants in specific sectors. This is not a complete list, but these are arguably the big ones. And one of them is Advanced Clean Cars 2. This is a tricky one right now. Advanced Clean Cars 2, because it is a mobile source regulation, this is a regulation where California needed a waiver from EPA. What does that mean? What it means is that most states are not able to reduce pollution from mobile sources. But in the Clean Air Act, California had special permission because of our need and our history in reducing air pollution from mobile sources. There's something called the waiver process. And basically what the Clean Air Act says is no states can reduce pollution from mobile sources. And then there's a subpart that says, well, California can get a waiver from this if they can show that there's a need and the technology is available. And there's a process for that, which we've done. And then EPA proposed to approve a waiver for Advanced Clean Cars 2, and very recently EPA has revoked that waiver. And so we've had mobile source regulations in the past that where we did get the waiver and kept the waiver, and we were able to take credit and realize those emissions reductions, but that is in fact called into question and in jeopardy, very much in jeopardy right now. One of the arguments you hear sometimes is, well, why should California get special permission? You're just making a patchwork of regulations. And that's just not true. First of all, California regulated mobile sources before anyone else and has the greater need. And so the federal government in the Clean Air Act for decades and decades has recognized this authority and this need in California, and there's a process for it. There's an open process that's well documented, and so this is not something behind closed doors. And it's not really a patch. It might look like a patchwork here, but let me tell you what this is. This is a list of the states that are using California standards, and so no one can regulate mobile sources except California. But then other states have the choice. Other states can either use California standards or use the federal standards. And there are several states that do in fact choose to use the California standards because of the air pollution climate benefits that are important to those states. And so it's not a patchwork. The entirety of the states that use California regulations, about 40% of the motor vehicle market. So it's a really important way to reduce pollution through zero emission vehicles and cleaner vehicles. And it was recently, you can see this is a statement from the President of the United States from June 12th, basically saying that they are going to reverse EPA's granting of the waiver to reduce pollution from mobile sources. So, and I can't talk too much about this, but this is public record. You can find this yourself and track the conversation and see what's going on here. This is developing. California is fighting. California, so the president's statement was June 12th. California released a statement on June 12th saying we're not going to stand down on this. We're going to fight for these really important regulations that are critical to the health of Californians and really beyond. So stay tuned on that. California also released an executive order on zero emission vehicle deployment just like a week ago, or maybe 2 weeks ago. So very recently, and there's a link here, and I'm sure the slides will be available to participants later on. But all this is to say that this is even more challenging than ever before. But the technologies are available. Lots of people want these technologies. These technologies are proven to work. And while there's politics involved right now, and some of that can be very frustrating to people who've worked on these issues for a very long time. But the fight is going to continue, and that's also why you should all think about joining state service, because these fights are going to go on, and we need all the help we can get. So that was advanced clean cars. Let me tell you a little bit about the low carbon fuel standards. So while advanced clean cars deals a lot with the motor vehicles themselves and really encouraging zero emission vehicles, the low carbon fuel standard is another regulation that CARB has. And this is about the carbon intensity of fuels for the whole life cycle of the fuel. So what this means is that the low carbon fuel standard doesn't just look at the GHG emissions associated with the burning of the fuel, although of course that's part of it, but it looks at the entire life cycle of the fuel from the getting the raw materials to make that fuel, so producing the fuel, distributing the fuel, and consuming the fuel, and then all of that is calculated to be a carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule. So there's a lot of letters in that phrase right there. But basically what we're talking about carbon intensity for the life cycle of the fuel, and that basically entities that are covered by the low carbon fuel standard, they have to do reporting, they can generate credits or deficits, but they have to achieve certain targets so that overall California's fuel supply is decreasing its carbon intensity over time. And this rule has been in place for quite some time. As you can see here, we've been implementing and tracking it since 2011. It was recently amended, in fact, last fall, and as has been the talking point for some time. You may have read in the news or heard that there are concerns about how the low carbon fuel standard is increasing California fuel prices, and Californians that are buying gasoline are also often very sensitive to this issue of the rising fuel costs in our state. But this is something that CARB and other entities have been keeping an eye on for a really long time, and they can show that the historical low carbon fuel standard credit and retail fuel prices are not correlated. Despite some narrative and suggestions that that is in fact the case. So it's a complex issue, and it's something to keep an eye on and decide for yourself. But definitely seek out the data and review it, and see that it is complicated, and the low carbon fuel standard alone, that is not, it is certainly not what's driving fuel prices in California. And there's pretty good documentation to support that. Want to talk about HFCs, or hydrofluorocarbon reduction measures. These are coolants. And the tough thing about HFCs is as our climate gets hotter, we might want to cool ourselves and cool our food even more, but that's going to release even more HFCs. And so this is something, there's some really wonderful books on this issue. Just know that this is another area where CARB is in fact regulating to try to reduce hydrofluorocarbons. They're very potent, but it's not something you hear about as much as you do some of the other climate regulations. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on is the landfill methane regulation. This requires municipal solid waste landfills to reduce methane and other pollutant emissions through both monitoring and capturing fugitive methane. And this is a regulation that's been on the books for quite a while. We've had public workshops about it recently. Landfills are a very interesting issue. There are a handful of landfills in California that have had some issues lately. Many of which are not directly impacted by the landfill methane regulation, but many people have questions about what the landfill methane regulation does and how it works. And it's actually pretty interesting. I nerd out a little bit when I think about the landfill methane rule, because there are some fascinating technologies that can monitor for emissions on the ground, using remote sensing from like satellite lights and aircraft, and just pay attention to the methane emissions coming from landfills. Landfills of a certain size have to have certain cover requirements, and they have to have gas control and collection systems, and they have to monitor for leaks. And it's a very technical and complex regulation, but it's just another example of how across sectors it's never going to be one size and fits all. We need every tool that we can have to try to reduce the climate pollutants for the sake of California. And this is just a picture of satellite methane detection. Another recent facet of our state climate laws is this California Corporate Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. And this was authorized by 2 state bills very recently, Senate Bill 253, as well as Senate Bill 261, which were both adopted by legislature in 2023, and require the California Air Resources Board to come up with regulations and a process for businesses that are making at least $1 billion to disclose greenhouse gas emissions for the fiscal year. This is in progress right now. There are also legal challenges associated with this, First Amendment challenges, and really interesting sub-issues that are still being parsed out. So this is not, none of this is final, but I think if you're interested in state climate laws, it's interesting to think about how do we get information on climate pollutants, and what do we do with that information once we get it. And so this is something that is also developing. If you are interested in these issues, you really should come to the 2023 Yosemite Conference. And this is just a partial list of all the panels at the Yosemite Conference this October that are going to talk about even more detail than the things I just flew by pretty quickly on today. And so you can see here we have a session on our first day about mobile sources, our zero emission vehicle goals and the federal pushback. We have a session on climate adaptation and sea level rise. We have state and local government opportunities for climate action. The Chiquita Canyon landfill situation. That one's not specific to climate change, but like I said, landfills do play a role in the state climate laws. I'm a big fan. What the F-bomb, climate pollutants you've never heard of, that's about F gases or HFCs, the coolants I talked about earlier. Session 9.2, holding the line, the philanthropy's role in advancing climate justice, and actually many more. I think the plenaries will likely touch on this as well. So the Yosemite Conference is really where you want to be, I think, if you want to dive into these issues even more. And before I pass the baton, I do want to also mention the other programming that CLA has done related to climate pollution. We have one coming up on Monday. So we occasionally have a book club where we read books and then get together to discuss them, the environmental law section. They're free to attend. You don't even have to read the book first. I hope people at least try or buy the book and support these wonderful authors and read some of the book. But we're having one on, it's blurry because I'm blurry. We're having one on this coming Monday by, it's called California Against the Sea, Visions for Our Vanishing Coastline. The author asks, as climate chaos threatens the places we love so fiercely, will we finally grasp our collective capacity for change? It's a really wonderful book, especially if you like the California coast, which I'm sure most of us do. So feel free to join us. The author is going to be there to answer our questions and to tell us about the things that happened as she wrote the book, and tell us about her other projects. And I did want to mention one. This is a blast from the past. We already read this book, but if you haven't read it, you still should. This is one of my favorite books that our book club read. It's called All We Can Change: Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. And this is a fabulous book. If you've ever had a rough day, in the past 8 months or so, or even beyond that, and it's so easy, the existentialism of it's so frustrating sometimes, and you feel like it's just a lot. If you've ever felt that way, I think that's normal. The world can't afford for us to feel that way for very long, because we got to pick ourselves up and keep fighting the good fight if you're the type to fight the good fight. And if you need a little motivation, All We Can Save, it's a wonderful book. We read it for book club a few years ago, so I like to mention that when I'm talking about climate change with people. And that I think that's about my 30 minutes. I did pretty good. So Suma, with that, I'm going to pass the baton to you.
I am very impressed, Jesse, about how much you covered in
I talk fast.
this short amount of time. That was very nutrient dense. I loved it. Thank you. Like Jesse, I wanted to begin with the standard disclaimer that I'm here in my personal capacity, that all the views I share during these remarks are mine alone. Not here on behalf of my employer or any other organization or entity. As I mentioned earlier, Samir, Darcy, and Jesse asked me to join today's webinar to talk about climate justice. I want to start by acknowledging, as one of my colleagues recently shared, given where we are as a country, EJ scholars and policy experts find ourselves becoming unexpected and unwilling historians. Of course, it's a difficult time to talk about justice, but I also can't imagine a more important time to fight for it. Both as individuals and as a society. Jesse, did you want to answer any questions now, or did you want to save them for the end?
Well, gosh, you're just gearing up. I do see really quickly, how are crematoriums and concrete producers regulated? Honestly, those are generally considered stationary sources. So as a stationary source, those are generally regulated by local air districts. And local air districts, they might not generally be focused on climate pollutants in particular. A lot of times they're looking at VOCs or particulate matter. There are no state regulations at this time that specifically reduce greenhouse gases from those facilities. That's all for now.
Thanks. Yeah, so as I mentioned, it's a difficult time to talk about justice, but it's an important time to do so. And, you know, it's also an important time to think about how we view and teach the law, right? We have a tendency to teach the law and see the law as something separate from morality, separate from basic ideas of right and wrong. And so, you know, it may be well time to more closely examine the humanity of that approach of teaching the law and viewing the law. But, you know, with that preamble, let's talk a little bit about climate justice. And before I get into law and policy, I wanted to set the stage with a little bit of background and context. So when climate justice advocates think about climate change, they think about the entire fossil fuel life cycle, cradle to grave. Each phase of that life cycle carries an unfair impact to EJ communities, starting from fossil fuel extraction to transport, to transloading of fossil fuel products, to refining those products, to the combustion of those finished products by stationary and mobile sources of pollution, and finally, to the climate change impacts of greenhouse gases, including catastrophic weather events and human displacement. And so let me provide concrete examples of each of these phases as it relates to oil here in California. So where have we seen a concentration of oil drilling? Communities in Kern County or Baldwin Hills in LA. Where do we see the transport of fossil fuels occur? We often see pipelines traveling through Native American ancestral lands and sacred sites. And it's also common to see pipelines traveling through other EJ communities. It's commonplace. So as for truck transport, I immediately think of the truck ban on 580 here, the 580 freeway here in the Bay Area, and the resulting concentration of truck traffic and associated pollution through West Oakland and other EJ communities along the 880 freeway corridor, which picks up the slack. In Los Angeles, I think about the 710 freeway, which connects refineries in LA and Wilmington and Carson more specifically to the rail yards in Southeast LA. Those trucks certainly pose a safety hazard to people and cars on the road, but they themselves often emit air pollution in the local communities they traverse. Same is true with diesel-fueled train transport. While we're on the subject of rail yards, whether in Southeast LA or across the Bay from where I am in Richmond, rail yards are where transloading operations occur from rail car to truck or pipeline or vice versa. Again, rail yards are most often located in EJ communities. And finally, when we think about climate-induced fires, hurricanes, floods, we also have to think about who's most vulnerable to permanent displacement from their homes, the accompanying financial ruin and cultural devastation. Who are the world's climate refugees, whether we're speaking domestically or globally? Again, we're talking about the same communities, right? Communities of color, low-income communities. And I want to be clear, the mass displacement of human beings due to climate change is not some far-off threat. This is a reality that is already happening. Look back at Katrina. Look at the recent fires in Southern California. And consider who is able to regain their footing, who is in the process of regaining their footing. Just in the past few days, look at the stunning images of flooding in Pakistan and the resulting devastation. As another stark example, look at the small South Pacific nation island of Tuvalu, which is in the process of moving its entire population to Australia due to climate-induced sea level rise. So the scale and immediacy of the climate crisis is forcing some interesting legal battles. We're seeing more and more EJ groups and state and local governments suing fossil fuel companies for knowingly causing climate-related damage by relying on what I call the OG of environmental laws, right? Nuisance law. Most often state nuisance law here in the US. This type of ingenuity exists in part because conventional environmental laws like the Clean Air Act, with its air basin-based pollutant by pollutant regulatory approach, those laws weren't originally designed to address the particular problem of climate justice or disparate impact. That said, sometimes I and other EJ advocates have certainly leveraged conventional environmental law like the Clean Air Act, whether it's calling for stronger state implementation plans, new source review enforcement, pushing for stronger national rules by EPA, or even novel theories under things like the regional haze provision of the Clean Air Act, which was actually meant to protect visibility in Class 1 areas. What are Class 1 areas? National parks. And oddly enough, we were able to use those visibility requirements to force very costly state-of-the-art pollution controls on aging coal plants in the Four Corners area and elsewhere throughout the country. And of course, I know that there's an elephant in the room when we're talking about the Clean Air Act and GHGs. As Jesse mentioned, we must acknowledge the imminent threat to EPA's 2009 finding that GHGs threaten public health and welfare, the endangerment finding. And that endangerment finding formed the basis for the very first greenhouse gas standards for vehicles, GHG standards for heavy-duty trucks, GHG standards for large stationary sources of climate pollutants, among others. Understanding the very real threat of this change, it's interesting to see some legal experts speculate that removing the endangerment finding could spur unintended consequences. So if we find ourselves in a world without the finding, some scholars are asking whether California will need EPA waivers to promulgate clean vehicle standards. Scholars are also asking whether without the endangerment finding, plaintiffs might be able to revert back to the federal common law of nuisance and avail themselves of federal nuisance claims in their climate cases without the same worries about Clean Air Act preemption. Either way, EPA's proposed rescission of the endangerment finding is a very big deal. And it's obviously something to pay very close attention to. I think it's fair to say that the outcome of this brewing legal battle is far from certain, even on an arbitrary and capricious standard of review. And if you're looking for more hope and inspiration about the future of GHG regulation, apart from what Jesse just gave you, I recommend that you start following my friend and former colleague, Adrian Martinez at Earth Justice. He's urging California to spearhead the fight against these federal rollbacks, and he's already gearing up for what he calls the great rebuild that he predicts will occur in the next administration. And in truth, Adrian's optimism and resolve is well-founded. Here in California, EJ litigators, including me, have historically used a wide range of legal tools in all phases of the fossil fuel life cycle. And there's been a strong and effective collective resistance to things like oil refinery expansions, dirty power plant expansions, and new crude oil transloading operations. As just some examples of those strategies, we've intervened in CEC proceedings to challenging licensing actions, intervened in CPUC proceedings to shift the economics of dirty power, engaged local land use and regulatory agencies in permitting proceedings, all for the cause of climate justice. So when we think about the legal toolbox for climate justice, we've actually won some of our best results leveraging the law you're all familiar with, CEQA. CEQA's strong focus on disclosure and mitigation of human health impacts and cumulative impacts has historically made it an incredibly powerful tool of last resort for EJ communities fighting for climate justice. Also, because of its focus on human health, I find that CEQA allows for the most facile bridge between environmental law and civil rights law, or disparate impact law, in the context of protecting air quality. So for an example of how I've been able to draw a connection between significant air quality impacts under CEQA to the concept of disparate impact to protected classes under civil rights law, I'd urge you to take a look at the EJ chapter of the Bay Area Air District's CEQA guidance document. There are also some enhanced tribal consultation provisions in that CEQA guidance document. I mean, of course, we can't ignore the fact that the CEQA statute is perpetually under attack, including the most recent weakening of it. And some might actually argue that CEQA is such a popular target precisely because of its historical power as the last line of defense to EJ communities. But moving on, historically, EJ groups have also relied on civil rights laws directly, specifically the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the state law analog Government Code 11135 as one example of an effective use of civil rights law about a decade ago. My former colleagues, Gladys Limon and Maya Golden-Krasner, sued the City of LA for discriminatory permitting practices when it comes to oil drilling operations. They sued under Government Code Section 11135. That lawsuit transformed the way the City of LA engages in permitting, its permitting practices for oil drilling. And now the city better protects EJ communities in those permitting actions. You know, of course, at the federal level, we know that the administration has cut civil rights compliance efforts by US EPA. And it's no secret that the US Supreme Court is moving to the right when it comes to civil rights. So it'll be interesting to see how federal and state civil rights laws fare in this new era. That's something else to watch out for on the climate justice front. So given all the uncertainty we're facing, I kind of wanted to end my remarks on a more positive note. And so zooming out to the international stage, I just want to point out that last month, the International Court of Justice sided with a number of small and heavily hit island nations in the global south, finding that the members of the United Nations, including the US, have obligations to address greenhouse gas emissions and are obliged to take action to protect the life-giving climate system and to honor agreements around funding international climate mitigation and reparations payments. Under the ICJ decision, countries in the global north also have an obligation to phase out their production, consumption, and subsidies of fossil fuels as soon as possible. Of course, the enforceability and impact of this ICJ decision on the US remains to be seen. But international law scholars expect this ruling to spur litigation, and that will test the decision's reach and its limitations. But to me, to end on the topic of humanity, where I started, it's really interesting to see the decision's framing of climate change as a human rights issue. An issue governed by international human rights law, separate and apart from international environmental law. And so in that sense, the decision is an exciting read. And so we'll see what happens. And that's what I have.
Thank you so much. And let's see, we have another question. I'm going to just read it. Looking at my ability to reduce pollution by my own actions, what is the chance of success in using nuisance claims versus manufacturers of gardening equipment without any pollution controls? Culver City not enforcing noise limits on gardening equipment and stated they do not have funds to replace with electric equipment. Workers are likely to get lung cancer from the use of equipment, and LA air quality and noise levels can benefit from reducing this equipment. So the question in the Q&A is about just looking for ways to reduce pollution. Well, it's multifaceted. One, how do you reduce pollution beyond your own actions? And I think, one of the things you can do is just support the actions of your local and state government to do the things that they're doing on the scales they're doing. Keep reading, keep paying attention, keep asking questions. Help us work for an organization or an agency that's working on these issues. There are some specific questions here about lawn and garden equipment. That issue is challenging. I've seen air districts work on that issue in the past. There are programs for zero emissions lawn equipment at some air districts. Some jurisdictions do in fact have noise reduction. It can be very localized problem. So I'm afraid I don't have an easy answer that's going to be a one size fits all. But I think I'll have to leave that one at that. Sumi, did you have anything to add on that issue?
Yeah, just the kind of usual caveat that, we can't really provide legal advice.
That too, yeah.
And so a really important question, they suggest reach out to a lawyer and,
Yeah.
and get the legal counsel.
Yeah. And talk to your local
Yeah.
your local agencies and see what the laws are. I've certainly had situations where a concerned community member working with a local agency can at least raise awareness on an issue. What is citation for? You can give more information about the decision that framed climate change as a human rights issue. Okay, that one's for you, Suma.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the site. Give me a minute and I will try to put a link, or Doug, I can email you separately as well with that citation.
Great. Samir, did you have things that you wanted to mention here at the end just to kind of close us out to talk about any upcoming programs?
Yeah, I'm happy to, if there are no more questions.
I'll keep an eye on it. That was the last
Okay.
question I saw
Yeah.
so far.
Sounds good. So I think there will be more information on these items at the end of the what's posted, the slide deck that Jesse shared and that we had some information from early on. But just a few things, a few programs going on with the environmental law section that folks can get involved with. I kind of made passing reference to these early on with the ways to get involved slide, but just to give a little more information, coming up in the spring. We will be hosting our 24th annual law student negotiations competition. That's going to be at UC Law San Francisco. It's open to all students in California law schools who've completed their first year. Each school can enter a team and can nominate an alternate team as well. It's a competition format with 2 preliminary rounds and then 4 teams advance to the finals. And then there's prize money involved. The winning team gets $1,000, second prize gets $500. Registration will open this little bit later this year in the fall, and we're always looking for judges, volunteer judges, as well as sponsors for the program. It's a really great event. Our current chair of the environmental law section is a past winner of the negotiations competition. Another program that is actually kind of happening right now in terms of the application process is the environmental law section's Diversity and Inclusion Fellowship Program. This provides opportunities for law students from all sorts of diverse backgrounds to work in government and public interest environmental law organizations and to develop interests and skills in a wide, variety of environmental law disciplines. Those that get chosen to receive fellowships, they receive assistance finding placement in organizations where they'll do a summer internship of 8 to 10 weeks. So the current application cycle is for summer of 2026. They receive a stipend of $8,000. They become matched with mentors in the field. They get complimentary registration to the Environmental Law Conference in October following their fellowship completion. And there's a lot more information on that fellowship program on the CLA Environmental Law Section website, including the application due date, which is typically, I believe, the week after the end of the Yosemite conference, but specific information will be on the website. And then finally, Environmental Law Section has a separate mentorship program, and this is for pairing generally newer attorneys and law students with more experienced attorneys to help broaden their network, to develop meaningful professional relationships, to gain knowledge and insight into the profession, and even potentially, advice and counseling on transitioning within the field or outside the field. Of course, for the mentors, they get the benefit of obviously building their own network, but also contributing to the professional development of younger attorneys. Some people can use it as a potential recruiting tool if they're trying to bring folks into their organizations. And also, it's just a great way to give back to the profession. We actually have an application process for this program. It typically closes in December, and then the mentors get assigned in the new year. So again, more information on the ELS and the CLA website. I think there's one more question that just popped up.
And I just,
yeah.
Celeste, I put in our chat the link for book club. So don't forget, book club is on Monday. You can find information on the Environmental Law Section webpage. I would love to have the slides you showed. I believe they are posted or will be soon, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And where are they posted?
They will be sent to all attendees that attended this webinar as the materials. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jesse and Suma. Really informative, insightful, great presentation. Thank you all who attended and for the great questions, and to Celeste and to Darcy and everybody at CLA who supported. So tune in next time for the 101.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.